Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Welcome back, everyone. We are going to continue our conversation with Mike Carter, the coordinator for the Playa Lakes Joint Venture, and Matt Hough, Ducks Unlimited's manager of conservation programs in Kansas, about some innovative solutions that have been developed in their region to help us conserve playa wetlands across a much broader supporter base. And it's a fascinating conversation. They've been incredibly successful growing their base of support for these conservation efforts. And so I encourage you to go back to the previous episode, get caught up on the background of this. We're going to jump right back in with Mike and Matt. And when we concluded the previous episode, we had sort of covered the historical aspects of this, what your playa conservation efforts looked like when you were just trying to focus on the benefits to birds. And so somewhere along the way, Mike, y'all began to realize that, hey, if we're really going to grow our impact on this landscape to conserve these important habitats, and I say habitats, but these important wetlands that provide bird habitat, but that also provide other services, we're going to have to start championing these benefits to in a way that makes our efforts relevant. So take us through the moments of revelation or the key activities that y'all engaged in to kind of help you make those significant steps. And I guess also the one thing that I'm kind of curious about is, was there any reluctance on the part of the Playa Lakes Joint Venture Management Board, because this wasn't without risk, because it took some resources, right? You had to commit some time and resources in order to explore this other avenue. And so I'm just kind of curious if there was any trepidation about this as you got into it.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my history with the joint venture, it's been a long time, but you have to go back and remember that we've been communicating about playas for 20 years or more, and probably a lot of the listeners have never heard of that wetland type. So one of the things we wanted to do was do a survey, and this is exactly what you were talking about, that to do a survey of 1,800 landowners is very, very expensive. But we asked all the usual questions, have you heard of a playa? Are you in favor of playa conservation? What do you need? Strongly agree, strongly disagree, all that kind of stuff. And then in crafting that survey, we said, why don't we just ask a list of resource questions and have them rank them or state a preference for all that. And so we made a list of about 14 things, everything from waterfowl, grasslands, conservation reserve program, prairie dogs, all that list. And at the last second, we kind of said, well, let's throw Ogallala Aquifer in there. And because we were becoming aware of some research about playas and recharging the aquifer at the time, when that survey came back, there was only one thing of this long list of things that we gave people that they wanted to see more conservation of, and it was the Ogallala Aquifer. And prairie dogs was at something like 4% support, so we kind of knew the survey was accurate based on that. But that really struck us, that we had playas listed in there, but they were basically saying, if you're going to work on something, this is what we would like you to work on. And at the same time, we were looking at very recent evidence showing that playas actually recharged the aquifer. So that set us to work on almost a decade-long communications program saying, did you know that playas recharge the aquifer that you're so concerned about? And that to me is really the start and the foundation of the whole thing.
Before we go too much farther, for those that may not be familiar, and again, this is one of those questions what I'll kind of ask you guys who wants to answer, maybe just a rudimentary explanation of the Ogallala Aquifer and the significance of of what's happening with it, the significance of the decline in that aquifer. Who wants to take that question?
I would love to hear Matt answer it, but I think I should probably take it because I talk about it all the time. This is a 174,000 acre reservoir underground, but you cannot envision it as a reservoir. It's filled with material, so envision more like a huge jar with marbles in it and straws in that water, and that's what drives the whole economy. In places, this jar is 500 feet thick or deep, and in other places it's just 80 feet thick or deep. And then in some places it comes above the ground where you have an artesian spring. This aquifer is really what drives the whole economy of the Southern Plains. We grow 45% of the U.S. wheat, 60% of the U.S. cotton because of this aquifer. The problem with all that is that it's overused. And so in some places, and this is astounding, of those numbers that I mentioned before, we're down to 30 feet left. And that's about the amount of water where it's hard for a pump to actually get the water out of the ground. That's not to say the whole aquifer is dry. There's still places where there's 300 feet of usable capacity. I don't think it would be overstating to say that this is an emergency situation.
Wow.
And so that's what is really, really driving the concern about the aquifer, and probably the interest in Playas. They recharge the aquifer, but not really at a level to support, irrigation at the rates that we've been talking about. The center pivots and the center pivot sprinklers that you see, they're pulling 700 gallons a minute out of the ground to irrigate crops in this region. And so that tells you, how much water is coming out, and it tells you how much water there was, because this has been going on for maybe 50 years, just post World War II.
Wow. I'm on the verge of asking you a series of additional questions about the aquifer, but in the interest of time, I wanted to talk more about the conservation. I think we'll leave those maybe for a future episode to talk just about the Ogallala and some of the crises that you're talking about there. So let's talk about let's just transition to some of these innovative solutions that you started developing, and it's not as though I don't think you created any new techniques for restoring playas or protecting playas. It's primarily just the way you communicated the benefits that they provided, right? And trying to align those benefits with the people that need it most. And so I know there's one story that was highlighted often as the efforts of the Playa Lakes joint venture got underway. And that is in the city of Clovis, and how you have a partnership with that municipality. But so I'm going to turn this over to you, Mike, and I want you to take us through this to the extent and in the manner that you would like to see it highlighted. Spend as much time you want on Clovis, but then I also know that the particularly exciting part of what you're doing now is you're expanding that effort into other regions, and I know Matt is involved heavily in that. So I'm going to turn this over to you to help guide us through this particular part of the conversation.
Yeah, based on the survey that said that landowners wanted us working on the Ogallala, 10 years later we checked in with landowners through some focus groups all through the region, and we got some interesting messages. How much is the recharge? How long does it take? And even disbelief about all of that. And they said that they wanted the information from a credible source. And sometimes, like, people aren't always a credible source to people that are in the farming and agricultural community, because we're just not from that community. So we pulled together a bunch of hydrologists and geologists and basically said, tell us where we're on thin ice, tell us what our messages should be, and tell us the numbers that we should be saying so that we're not misleading people. and basically locked them in the room for a day and a half and asked them to answer those questions for us. And then those answers became the basis of our communications and our work going forward. And one thing they told us was to say that on Playas and the recharge to the aquifer, we're not recharging at a rate that really helps the irrigation-based economy. But we're really good for municipalities, cattle ranching, and dryland ag and households and things like that. So armed with that information, we knew that the city of Clovis was working on their Playas. We knew that there was some interest there. We knew that the community was situated on just a little bit of water left in the aquifer.
And this is Clovis, New Mexico, right?
Yes. Yep. It was the town of Clovis, about 35,000 people, half of them Hispanic, way out in eastern New Mexico, probably closer to Texas than really, Santa Fe or anything like that. And just asked for a meeting with the mayor and county commissioners and some producers, and they said, sure, why not? And there's a big water conference, and kind of before we knew it, we're working on Playas, about 371 Playas to the north and west of town, and working on restoring those Playas so that the recharge of those Playas head towards the town. The town developed a water assurance plan, and there's, I think, 5 main strategies in that plan. And so this is political folks working on providing water for their town, and at least 2 of those strategies in there were about Playas as far as restoring them and actually protecting them. And it's really, I guess, crazy to hear that we are actually going to get Playa protection out of this effort. So you can talk about protecting Playas and putting easements in this landscape basically until you're blue in the face. But when you start talking about protecting people's future water, then they become allies with you on protecting Playas because those are sources of their future water. So it was like a night and day change or epiphany to us that, maybe we're onto something here.
Mike, talk just a minute about the specifics of how this recharge occurs. I want to make sure we have that link between the Playas and the aquifer, and want to make sure that our listeners understand what we mean by recharge.
Yep. And then the way I described Playas in the previous episode, and people might want to go back to that, I was just talking about the Playa Basin itself. But you have to envision these saucers or the basins are inside of these huge watersheds. And the watersheds are internally drained, meaning that whatever water that lands on the watershed falls in, it eventually ends up into the playa. So the playas are going through wet and dry cycles with these clay bottoms. And the clay bottoms, when they dry out, you get these huge cracks in them, anything from a couple inches to you could drop a car tire down there and it would disappear. And when the water hits this watershed, it'd be like a section of land feeding a 20-acre playa. You get a huge flush of water that goes towards the playa into these cracks, and then once it gets past the root zone of the plants, we call it infiltration, and then it becomes recharge because it's on its way to the aquifer. And a lot of the underlying rocks and layers have been dissolved, and so it's almost a clear path to the aquifer, which can be hundreds of feet below, and it might take 60 to 80 years for the water to get there. But the point is the water's on its way.
Wow. That's pretty cool. Okay, so we've introduced Clovis, New Mexico as sort of the pilot effort, you might call it, and you talk about whatever success you want to there. But then I know you also want to talk about the expansion into other states and other municipalities that are similar to Clovis in their water issues.
Yeah, and that's where Ducks Unlimited comes in, and I kind of want Matt to tell the story of the work to restore Playa in Kansas. But we take this model from New Mexico and we export it to Kansas, and the story and the geology is all basically the same. But then you go to a landscape where there's really a well-developed conservation network, and that's what Matt does in his day job. And I think just having Matt talk about all the different programs that they're bringing around to Playa and what people do on a daily basis would be really good.
So Matt, let's hear from you.
Sure. I'll start with kind of the history there and how I got started and our program got started in Playa. So I guess it was about 5 or 6 years ago when I started working in Kansas and out of Nebraska, and we have these conservation delivery maps for DU that shows where all our accomplishments are annually and collectively over the years. And I noticed there's just a big blank spot in western Kansas where there just wasn't a whole lot going on, and we knew that resource was out there, that these playas were out there and they're a priority. So we wanted to start exploring how to build that program. And one of our biologists and myself, we started just basically going out and driving around and trying to meet people, set up meetings with producers and go to their kitchen table and just kind of hear them out and what they thought about the playas, what they liked about the programs they're aware of and what they didn't like, and trying to meet with the partners locally that knew some producers and kind of went from there. That's how it all really started. And Mike was right there with us the whole time. But I think what we found was a lot of it just the people weren't aware of them. They weren't aware that what a playa was. They weren't aware that they had value. They just thought of them as a wet spot in their wheat field that caused them problems and got their tractors stuck. So once we started introducing, like, hey, there's all these cool farm bill programs that are available to you, and there's these different partners that can come to the table, it really started to open the door to us to work with people. It was kind of a lot of low-hanging fruit at the beginning, and just a lot of kind of innovative, progressive producers that were willing to hear us out and try something new, and it got really successful. So we met with some of those kind of early adopters out there in western Kansas, and they started coming to our workshops. We started with some diners and small workshops locally, and then that evolved into kind of a regional annual workshop with our partners at Kansas Alliance for Wetlands and Streams, and we put those on together, and it just kind of was a natural evolution. So started building, what DU does, we go after funding, so we look for opportunities to partner with businesses and donors, and went after North American Waterfowl Conservation Act grants or NACA grants, and then promoting farm bill programs as well. So we basically having the combination of just a whole lot of people that were interested because of the groundwater recharge and because of the benefits, but also because they just haven't heard of a lot of these things before. It was a really fun opportunity to work in a new landscape and kind of start something from scratch. So can't say enough about the partnership. We couldn't do it without everybody there, all the state agency, Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks and Tourism, Pheasants Forever, Department of Conservation there in Kansas, conservation districts, and of course the Natural Resources Conservation Service and Farm Service agencies. Those they have a lot of the funding and a lot of the opportunities to put habitat on the ground. So it seemed like a perfect storm, I guess I should say, because it was kind of, we were entering into a wet cycle. Commodity prices were starting to decline. The limits on irrigation and the ability for people to irrigate their farmland, there were starting to become more regulations on that. So people were eager for those opportunities. And then Mike and his team and some of the other partners had gotten a new conservation reserve program, CRP practice on the ground called 38B, which was a new innovative approach for CRP that was very successful. And then combination of that and the Wetland Reserve Easement Program, WRE, that through NRCS, that was also very well received early on and continues to be through the history. So it enabled us to both fundraise and increase our capacity. I'm a big proponent of boots on the ground can make all the difference if you get the right folks. So we've got a biologist, a full-time biologist in Garden City that does a lot of this work with us and does a lot of the outreach efforts. And I can't say enough about him and our other team, the rest of our team out there in Kansas, and their ability to work with producers and get people across the finish line for conservation.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
Matt, what are some specific examples of the type of actions that we implement on Playa wetlands? You've alluded to a couple of these, I think, through the Wetland Reserve Easement Program. I think that's what you called it, and then some of the other CRP programs. But like I benefit, and I think our listeners would, by trying to visualize exactly the type of work that we're doing. Like on the Gulf Coast or the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, I can talk about infrastructure that we're responsible for either replacing or installing to kind of, whether it be levees and berms or water control structures. What are some specific examples of the type of restoration and protection, or just restoration and protection that goes on to benefit Playa wetlands out there?
Sure. The typical playa, at least in our region, is definitely in farm country. They've been cultivated for decades. A lot of times the disturbance of the grass has led to sedimentation. So on a runoff event, that bare soil is going to run into the wetland, and that material, that sediment that goes into the playa wetland, basically reduces its ability to function like a playa. It fills those cracks that Mike talked about and reduces its ability to recharge the aquifer. There's also a lot of ditching and pits that have been installed in those to help concentrate the water. So there's a whole lot of hydrological impacts. Roads have been installed, obviously, section lines, terracing, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of things that have impacted the functions of the playas. So what we do, there's not a whole lot of heavy duty engineering as in some DU projects around the country. They're pretty simple. Do a sediment study on the property to figure out how much material to remove, if any. Plug any ditches that might be cutting the wetland hydrology off or taking water away from the basin. Installing native buffers. That was a big win for us. Historically, you just take tallgrass prairie species and plant the whole property to those robust tallgrass species. But we're dealing in the high plains, which would have been historically a shortgrass prairie. So the ability that we now have is to put those more appropriate species around these wetlands for their buffer. So one, it reduces the sediment, it holds the soil, and two, those shorter species allow more runoff and water, clean water, to get to the bottom of the wetland and help recharge. Something else that was a little innovative, I think, early on was our ability to work off-site. Typically you have one neighbor that wants to go into CRP or whatever practice, and that's the end of the project. But we wanted to kind of look at these projects holistically. How do we get the water on the neighbors to stop causing them problems and get to the wetland where it should be? So we tackled a lot of that, like installing culverts, removing terraces, and so a little bit of everything there. The bread and butter is for us is permanent easements. We love to see those permanently protected. So Wetland Reserve Easements is the NRCS program that allows protection. 100% restoration costs can be covered with the program, as well as a nice payment to offset the income loss there. So those are always what we kind of start the conversation with. But there's a lot of other there's easement options that are out there. The shorter term opportunities like CRP are 10 to 15 year contracts, but kind of get the same benefit on a shorter term. So kind of everything in between. We have cost share programs that help offset some of the restoration expenses for the landowners. We work with our partners at Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism, have their walking hunting access or WEHA program. So that is also a really great income potential for the producers to restore their wetland, get paid for their public hunting access, and then just, that additional opportunity for people to use the resource and enjoy those playas. So that's been another good partnership.
Matt, that was too good of an acronym to not go back and ask a question about WEHA. I mean, I grew up watching Hee Haw. So tell me about. And actually, matter of fact, funny story. I was at the Central Flyway meeting a few weeks ago, and I saw a fellow wearing a hat that had the WIHA on his hat, and it was exactly that program, I think. So tell our listeners about that again. I don't want to give that just a passing blow.
Sure. So that's Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism, the Walk-in Hunting Access Program, or WEHA. It's been a hugely successful program, one of the best private lands access programs in the country. They have over 1 million acres in the state of Kansas. You can get on their website, or there's atlases that are available, grocery stores and Walmarts, that you can pick one up and figure out where all the properties are that are open to the public on private lands. And it's a great way to increase public hunting opportunities. There's a fishing atlas as well for the fishing people out there, and great way for the producers to get some extra income. And we love it. It's kind of an extra incentive for some people to both put conservation on the ground and it gets this bonus access. So it's great.
Another question for you, Matt. You referenced pits in some of these playa wetlands. I've read enough literature on the waterfowl and wetland field arena to have come across references to pits in playas. And my understanding, tell me if I'm correct here, that activity is most prominent in the Texas Panhandle. So correct me if I'm wrong about that. And then also tell our listeners what that is and why they do that.
Sure. I've run across it quite a bit in Nebraska as well. Basically, they're either through the irrigation process, so people wanted to reutilize some of the runoff water from irrigation, or just concentrate the water in the wetland so it's not dispersed across the flats of the wetland. They want to concentrate it to make farming more easy. So the impacts are pretty significant hydrologically. I mean, I guess just thinking about it, you think, deeper water, that's great. That's more consistent for the birds, but in reality, it's not very good water to begin with. It's really deep. It never dries out. It doesn't allow those cracks to form to allow for recharge. And then additionally, it breaches through that clay lens of the playa, temporarily at least, and allows a lot of the water that may be, polluted with agricultural chemicals and other stuff you don't want going into your aquifer to go through. Straight into the wetland, or straight into the aquifer, before the clays and the soils can kind of clean up that stuff. But those concentration pits are very prevalent in Texas. I know Mike could probably talk more about that. But in Kansas, we just try to fill those back to the historic elevation of the ground there, and plug them and get the compaction needed to make sure the water's not going through. We have had several landowners say, well, why don't we just start digging pits in all of them to help the water get through faster? But again, it's kind of a water quality issue at that point, and it takes away the functions and values of those wetlands and all the other great services that they provide.
Matt, I have another question for you. Being the Ducks Unlimited guy that's doing wetland restoration, the core of our membership is hunters, come from a hunting background. We have obviously a diversity of members, and really what drives us is providing habitat for waterfowl. So tell me, from your perspective as a Ducks Unlimited biologist, how have you sensed this new way of selling wetland conservation where maybe you're not emphasizing as much the benefits to waterfowl, again, coming from Ducks Unlimited, but now you're talking more about the benefits to aquifer recharge. How do you feel about that? I guess is is it anything new to you? I'm kind of struggling to ask my question here, but I guess the nature of it is, does it feel weird as a Ducks Unlimited employee to be conserving wetlands on the basis of aquifer recharge instead of waterfowl benefits?
It's funny. I just had a similar conversation with Dr. Steve Adair on this topic, and I kind of come from a bit of a non-traditional background for DU. I got my master's at Oklahoma State in wetland hydrology and soils, so I kind of come from this background a little more than most of my counterparts are waterfowl biologists in their background. So when I look at wetland, I've been kind of steeped in the ecosystem goods and services of wetlands my career, and definitely an avid waterfowl hunter myself, but I've never met a wetland I don't like. So I think historically, if we kind of needed to turn down a project because it didn't have the public access component, or it wasn't in the right concentration area for us, it was kind of disappointing for me, just because I want to fix them all if we can, So it's been kind of a fun thing for me, because we kind of were on the innovative end of this, the people projects in Kansas, just because we had several opportunities that came up, and we found the funding and we got them done. So it's kind of nice now that, from my perspective, that I get to work on a little bit more, little different projects. Not that we aren't going to keep doing what we've been doing. We're not taking our foot off the gas pedal at all there. It's just kind of a new and innovative way to get conservation on the ground. And I often say, from people that say we just do duck projects, we don't do, endangered species projects. I say, well, we put a no whooping crane sign on every wetland project we do, but they still use them. They don't read our signs. So.
That's right. Haven't figured out how to teach birds how to read.
Yep.
Mike, I want to ask you that same question. You've been with the Playa Lakes joint venture for going on 20 years now. And you've come through this time where the benefits were originally sold based on their biological, or the conservation was sold primarily on biological benefits at the beginning, and now you're doing it for aquifer recharge and maybe some other environmental services. What has been your personal response, reaction, feeling relative to all of that?
It's like night and day, and if I could think of something that was more contrasted than night and day, I would use that metaphor. You walk into a room in the past and say, we want to work on ducks and we want to do a NACA grant, and it's why and what's a NACA grant. And now you walk in a room and you say, we want to work on playas. We want to help you with, your business. We want to help with the aquifer, and in one meeting, people will say, let's get to work. And then it's up to the biologist to know what you're doing in the background to say, we're still getting benefit, we're still getting wetlands, we're just going into this a different way. The real example here is that we just put together a grant it's on the order of a North American Wetlands Conservation Act grant. It's like $1 million. But it's called a Regional Conservation Partnership Program grant through NRCS. We asked for approximately $1.3 million, and we had match from the community. This is 2 counties where total there's maybe 3,500 people living in this area. They came up, and DU and PLJV came up with $1.5 million of match. And so you go to the county road department and they say, this is important. We have graders. We have equipment. We can help you with the sediment. We will offer $100,000 of in-kind services of our heavy equipment to help you. That's how different it is.
Wow.
We're not paying for that. We're not having to contract it. It's being volunteered. And then so all the partners that Matt mentioned earlier, we've added Groundwater Management District, we've added the Kansas Water Office, we've added the Kansas Department of Health, We've added the city, we've added the county. It's completely different. And we both, Matt and I, say we're not forsaking wildlife. We're not forgetting about that. We're just knowing what the real driver is here, and then we're tracking what the waterfowl benefit is, basically in the background. And so the joint venture can do all that. That if we do 1,000 acres of playas in these two counties, we can tell you what the waterfowl benefit is. But we probably won't get asked that question during this whole project, that we don't care, because the benefit is there and it's going a lot faster.
That's an amazing story, and I can't identify anything in my short career that would be as stark of a contrast. And it's rare that you get one of these examples, such as what you described, where you're able to make strides in conserving an important part of our ecosystem at a scale that is broader than what you could do if you just tried to sell that conservation based on one or two other benefits that relate directly to wildlife. And so to be able to get other people to recognize the value of what you do, I imagine has to be just incredibly rewarding. And I could sit here and talk about it for the rest of the afternoon, asking you different questions about specific examples. But I think we probably want to try to start wrapping this up. Again, a phenomenal example of how we can be successful conserving wetlands for waterfowl and other wetland birds based on the benefits they provide to broader segments of society and other ecological services that those systems provide. Before we close out, Mike and Matt, I want to give each of you, and Mike, I'll start with you, an opportunity to share anything else that may be on the horizon. You can share any information about how people can get in touch with you, where they can look for additional information on the work that you've been doing. So, Mike, anything in that regard?
No, I think the end of the story is that when you go in and ask people how you can help, I think I said this before, but I've never been in a meeting where the producers are saying, well, okay, thanks for helping, but how can we help you? Aren't you here for wildlife? And I've never had that experience either. And so that's part of the whole rewarding aspect of this. The joint venture has pretty well-developed communications, and anybody can get a hold of us at tealjv.org. There's a lot of great films there, documentaries, the producers talking about the relationship to playas, and I urge people, if they want to do a deeper dive, to go to that website and look for those videos and maps of playas and all kinds of things about playas and what the work that the joint venture partnership is doing. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk today.
Absolutely. And Matt, I want to turn to you now, and anything else that you want to share with respect to any new initiatives or new efforts that Ducks Unlimited is engaged in, and how people can get in touch with you or any of our other Ducks Unlimited biologists if they may be interested in learning more about playa restoration opportunities.
Sure. Yeah, we're always looking to expand. There's a lot of states left, and my counterparts there that have opportunities to work with playas. So we're always wanting to build the program. Just to reach me, just ducks.org Kansas page or your respective state of interest, and we'd be happy to talk to you and do the work together.
I think that's going to wrap it up, guys. I, again, reiterate how incredibly impressive this work is, and I look forward to seeing the rest of the story as we go through time. I know from some of the research and some of the publications you put out, there are more cities, more towns out there on the landscape that are facing similar issues. And so there's plenty of opportunities. So thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for the insights that you provide, and look forward to getting you back on the podcast sometime in the future to catch up on new developments.
My pleasure.
Sounds great. Thank you for the opportunity.
Special thanks to our guest on today's show, Mike Carter, coordinator of the Playa Lakes Joint Venture, and Matt Hough, Ducks Unlimited's Director of Conservation Programs in Kansas. We also thank our producer, Clayton Baird, the Electron Warrior, and all the great work that he does with the podcast and getting it out to you, our listeners. To our listeners, we thank you for your time. We thank you for spending it with us. We thank you for support of the podcast. We appreciate all your input and your reviews and ratings of the podcast. And most importantly, we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.